Welcome, everybody. It's really nice to see so many people joining us for this very important seminar. My name's Chris Frost. I'm chair of the NUJ's Ethics Council, and we're playing quite a role in this, isn't it? It's been part of a project that we've been working on for some months now, initially just about refugees in general, but more recently, of course, following the problems in Kabul and Afghanistan generally, in the whole of the country. I'm very pleased to say we've got some great speakers, and I'll introduce them as we go through. I just very quickly wanted to say a couple of small adverts. If you want to send some money to the IFJ Safety Fund, you can do that at ifj.org/safety-fund.html, and I'm sure Jeremy will be making a plea for that as well later. And I also wanted to remind people of an important element coming from this is the NUJ's Code of Conduct, which says how journalists should behave fairly, how they should behave accurately, and certainly how they should talk about matters of discrimination. And we have guidance on our website that you can access, both in terms of guidance about how to deal with the issue of refugees, but also about discrimination generally. Anyway, you didn't come to hear me witter on, so I'll introduce our first speaker. Very pleased to be able to invite Farhad Mohammadi to talk to you today. He's only recently managed to get out of Afghanistan and come to the UK. His BBC work, many of you I'm sure will know, and his the Panorama documentary that he worked on, War Crimes Scandals Exposed, won Press Gazette British Journalism Award last year. So he's a man who really knows what he's talking about, and it'll be great to hear what he has to say. Farhad, over to you.
Thank you very much. Alongside this, I used to be the head of the BBC staff union in Afghanistan. I am still involved with efforts to evacuate all employees and the families from Afghanistan. I'm very, very proud to be here as speaker and represent around 100 BBC Afghan colleagues in Afghanistan and now in the UK. Let me start with the evacuation story of the first groups of BBC colleagues from Kabul to the United Kingdom. On the 21st of August, I received an email from the British FCDO saying we are being evacuated to the UK by the British Army. I had to leave home immediately, but it was not easy. I was leaving behind my parents and my little sister as the only son and brother. I left home in tears, fear, but also in hope, and joined a group of colleagues at the entrance of the International Forces base in Kabul. Thousands and thousands of people were there, people with documents and without documents, all desperate to escape Afghanistan. The pressure of the crowd was so terrible. We were afraid that our small children would lose their lives on their own feet. You have all seen the pictures of chaos of the airport. We spent the whole night in the crush of the crowd, just 300 meters away from the safety of the British soldiers. With relief, we were finally able to make our way onto the airplane and ultimately here to Britain. The following day, more of our colleagues followed the same dangerous path. It was the exact location where just one day later, more than 180 people were killed in an explosion. Thank God, no one from the BBC was there that day. Our coming to Britain was not just because of our union efforts in Kabul and our managers' attempts in London. The role of NUJ was outstanding. Let me thank Michelle and Swami in particular, who was involved in every single stage in order to get this done. I'm sure that without the effective role of NUJ, it would have been impossible for us to leave Afghanistan. We will never forget the kindness. Despite all the efforts made by our managers in London and the NUJ, which we are grateful for, there is still some work to be done. We call on NUJ to work closely with us to finish this vital mission. Firstly, We are a significant number of colleagues and families still stuck in Afghanistan. Despite all efforts, unfortunately, a large number of our colleagues, including a number of journalists, are still in Afghanistan and their lives are in danger. The issue is that they don't have passports or Afghan national ID cards. The passport and ID departments have been closed in Afghanistan since the Taliban came to power. We call on NUJ to talk to British government to help our colleagues and their families to leave Afghanistan without a passport or electronic ID card through a third country such as Pakistan or Qatar. This was something we saw at the beginning of the evacuation program, and recently some media outlets such as Deutsche Welle used the same tactic to take the journalists out of Afghanistan through Pakistan. In addition, the lives of some former BBC colleagues are also in danger. Those who used to be BBC employees for many, many years, but they are hidden at their homes due to security issues. We ask NUJ to help our former colleagues get to safety, as well as the families of those colleagues who lost their lives in Afghanistan during their time working for BBC, such as Ahmad Shah, Samad Rouhani, Umaid Khalwak, Nazir, and Ilham. Let me come to the second issue, the family members of colleagues who left behind in Afghanistan. As you may know, immediate family in Afghanistan has a broad meaning and includes parents, younger sisters and brothers, and children over 18. Separating families is like cutting off one of arms or legs. 2 days ago, a support service colleague called me from Kabul. It is rare for an Afghan man to cry, but he started to cry over the phone. He said he was having to choose between staying in Afghanistan and leaving behind his 3 adult daughters. He said his family suffered every second of every day. In another case, we have a colleague who had a deaf son. His son's wife is also deaf and has recently
Laurie, take your time, no problem.
And has recently given birth to a baby boy. The young family rely heavily on the child's grandpa and grandma.
Would you prefer to come back to it, Farhad?
Yeah.
Are you okay?
Yeah, I'm okay. Thank you. As the baby's parents are not able to hear his cries, but they do not have permission to travel to the UK to join our colleague. A female colleague of ours spent a very difficult time getting to France and needs our help to travel and settle in the UK. Another colleague needs to join his wife, who is now in Turkey. We are envious when we see some of the British Army's former interpreters or Kabul embassy staff bringing their parents, adult children, or their little siblings to safety here in Britain. The UK government has done a great job to helping them. We appreciate that, but we would help to be treated equally. I request the support of the NUJ, BBC, and all human rights groups and activists to helping to get our families to safety. If any one of you in this meeting can help in this regard, please contact me. I also hope the NUJ will continue to work closely with us to ensure that the BBC rehire most of the qualified Afghanistan staff in difficult parts of the BBC in the UK. Let me thank you, the NUJ, once again for helping us during our journey and giving us such a great platform to share our stories. We are so grateful for the support we have been given so far. It is not over yet. Thank you very much, and God bless you all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that. Thanks for sharing that, all those difficult stories. I know how hard it must have been for you. Absolutely feel for you. We'll let you get your composure back again and move on to Daniel Trilling. I will just say to people watching, if you have questions for any of our panelists as we go through, you can either put something on chat if you just want to share the question with others, or put the question on the Q&A and I will take them at the appropriate time. Our next speaker is Daniel Trilling. He's a journalist, an author, an NUJ member, and he was editor of New Humanist magazine for a while. He's got two books, Lights in the Distance, Exile and Refuge in the Borders of Europe, and Bloody Nasty People, The Rise of Britain's Far Right. So he has some really good insights into some of the things that have been going on over the last few years. Daniel, can I pass the buck to you, please?
Yes, thanks very much for that introduction, Chris. And so I was asked to speak mainly about the work that I've done reporting on refugees and migration in Europe and the UK, which is something that I've been doing since about 2012 or 2013 now, and to reflect on some of the kind of ethical issues that arise from that. But I think actually what Farhad's contribution just now was making me think about is that if we're talking about the ethics of reporting on displacement, on human rights abuses, on people trying to flee situations like the one that many people are now facing in Afghanistan, I think the sort of most important ethical principle journalistically is to find ways that you can shape your reporting around what people's needs are. So being able to reflect, you know, what people need, how they can get it, how others can help them get it. And I think, you know, since late August, we've seen the media sort of coming to the fore there, both in terms of the coverage that's come out of Afghanistan and of people arriving in the UK or people trying to make journeys elsewhere. But also in terms of the solidarity that journalists and media workers have been able to show to colleagues who are trying to escape situations in Afghanistan. But I think often that's lacking, and or it can be very patchy. And I just wanted to reflect on sort of three areas in which I think journalism done on this topic is patchy and can, you know, there are ways we can improve what we do. First of all, I'm just thinking about the work that I've done as an individual reporter. So I spent a lot of time traveling to different bits of the European Union during the years of the kind of major refugee crisis. And I think there, what I saw was, obviously that was a major story where the media was doing what it does best, which was getting to the heart of a story very quickly and telling audiences, you know, sort of what the deal was, what people's needs were, and so on. But very often I would go to places and there would be this kind of feeding frenzy of journalists there. So there would be a group of people who, say, had recently arrived, say in Sicily, you know, people had been rescued from the Mediterranean. And then you would get the kind of media throng crowding around people literally as they were stepping off boats, dehydrated, you know, sort of disorientated and so on. And I feel that, you know, while there are good reasons for needing to get into those situations and report on what's happening, often I would see reporting that was either insensitive in terms of the journalists knowing how to deal with people who are distressed or perhaps even traumatized. Sometimes, depending on the slant of the media organization people were working for, questioning could be hostile or very blunt and so on. And another sort of major ethical issue that certainly was something I had to negotiate in what I was doing was kind of working out what my expectations as a journalist were of a particular situation. Say if I visited a refugee camp in Bulgaria or Greece or somewhere, and what kind of impression, or rather what the expectations of the people that I was speaking to were, and whether I was giving them an accurate impression of what I was going to be able to do for them or not. Because and this doesn't just go for refugee issues. I think if you report on any kind of sort of human rights issue or emergency situation, you're going to be dealing with people who are in quite desperate and constrained situations and are looking for help primarily. You know, they're not looking to sit down and chat at length with you about whatever it is you might want to talk about. And I think when I started out, there was very little sort of in the way of resources that I could turn to work out how do I sort of do my work there as a journalist ethically, but still get the material that I need, still produce good journalism and so on. The NUJ's guidelines on reporting these kind of issues have been really useful, and I should say I also use them when I do teaching and training, and they're very useful with students. So if people don't know about those, I would look at the resources that are on the NUJ website. But something else I would recommend people looking at is an organisation called the DART Centre for Journalism and Trauma, which is based in the US. It's got really good resources on this and runs training as well. The second area, just briefly, is, I suppose, the ethics of representation. And there, I'll try, I mean, there's lots one could say about this, but I think the constant thing that you see running through this issue and the way that the media organisations treat it, regardless of whether they're left-leaning or right-leaning, is they'll very often try and make distinctions between deserving and undeserving migrants. So at the height of the refugee crisis in 2015, which was a crisis involving people from all sorts of different countries, including in large part Afghanistan, there was this real focus, for instance, a lot of the time on Syrian refugees, with the implication that they were the genuine refugees and other people perhaps weren't. And that, I think, caused a lot of problems in the way the crisis was kind of discussed and represented in the media. I think, for reasons of brevity, I won't say too much more about that now, but if people want to discuss that more in the Q&A, I'm very happy to. But the final point was just me trying to have a few, is just an attempt to have a few thoughts about how you can correct for some of the kind of gaps that you see in a lot of media coverage of this issue. And I think, I'm sure people, you know, there's kind of how to negotiate coverage that politically one might disagree with as a journalist, but that's going to depend on your own political views as a journalist. So I'm not so interested in kind of a sort of pro-migration or anti-migration slant and what to do about that. What I think is more important for journalists is actually to think about how can you draw the fullest picture possible of this issue, because very often, regardless of the political slant of the media outlet, what you find is coverage that would tell you about the emergency situation, but not the underlying political decisions that led us to this crisis point. Or you will find that, you know, refugee stories will have a kind of flavour of the month aspect to them. So this year, the big story is Afghanistan. Next year, it might be some other crisis. You know, there's been, this year alone, there's been a horrific war in Ethiopia that's been displacing many people, and that has barely been covered, even though you have Ethiopians and Eritreans still, you know, crossing the Mediterranean, risking death and so on. And there need to be ways to sort of cover this more fully. I think one major part of that is also about what voices you bring into your media coverage and even who gets to do the reporting. I've learned a lot about that in recent years from a project I'm involved in at London College of Communication called the Refugee Journalism Project, which aims to, it creates training and mentoring schemes for exiled journalists who are now in the UK. But one thing that's convinced me is how important it is to have people not just represented in terms of the media coverage, but in terms of who gets to produce the journalism in the first place. And then a final point that I think is really important in the UK context at the moment is sort of having the knowledge and resources in newsrooms or among yourself and colleagues as journalists to be able to cover the huge amount of spin that comes out from the government on these kind of issues. So, you know, this week rather, we had the Home Secretary claiming that the asylum system was collapsing because there was this unprecedented weight of people crossing the channel in small boats. And that's just factually incorrect. The number of people claiming asylum in the UK is about par for the course at the moment. There hasn't been any great rise in asylum claims, at least. There's been a change in the way that people cross the channel, mainly because of the pandemic. But I saw that getting relayed across all sorts of media organisations without the full context being given. And I think that's something that is often lacking. And you know, even if we're not specialists in this subject, if we're working in newsrooms, it's something that we can all kind of contribute to fixing.
Excellent, thanks, Daniel. It's very useful stuff. We move on now to Michelle Stanistreet. Most of you watching will know Michelle as the NUJ's General Secretary, just re-elected for her third term. was going to say she's a glutton for punishment, but that's probably unfair. She's just a very hardworking and very deserving General Secretary. She followed on from Jeremy, obviously, who I'll introduce in a moment. She used to work on the Daily Express and has worked elsewhere. Michelle, do you want to talk about what the work the NUJ has been doing in this area, please?
Yeah, thanks very much, Chris, for the introduction, and thanks to the NUJ's Ethics Council for organising and hosting the meeting tonight. I've really enjoyed our contributors to date. It was, I thought, Daniel's points around representation and reporting and the ethics of that are really thought-provoking. It was particularly lovely to hear from Farhad and to put a face to his name, and for me personally it's an enormous relief that he's able to be here taking part with us, that he's here in the UK safe and able to participate properly. I think that personal insight into the awful challenges that he and his colleagues have faced, and something, as he says, that so many of the Afghan journalists continue to experience, I think it's very salutary and important to have that first-hand experience as part of our meeting this evening, and to kind of frame the discussion that we're having and the reason why the NUJ is so involved in this important issue. I mean, the situation faced in Afghan journalists, as everyone on this call I'm sure knows, is incredibly stark, with so many journalists still in Afghanistan who are in hiding or who are displaced. Many more who've got out, who are requiring help to try and get them to a final safe destination. And the NUJ has been inundated with appeals for help from individual journalists ever since the kind of crisis took hold. And we've taken those cases and immediately lodged them with the Foreign Office high-risk Afghan unit that they set up, seeking visas for those individuals to be able to travel to the UK. We've also added all of them to the IFJ's database of colleagues in need of assistance. And I would say, and we'll hear from Jeremy himself, but the IFJ throughout this period, they've really pulled out all the stops. They've been working round the clock to triage cases, to match up, you know, journalists the most at risk, and even having to take those decisions about having a kind of triage process of who's more at risk than somebody else is an incredibly difficult, horrible thing to have to do, but it's been a necessary part of this process. Trying to match up journalists in need of support with governments who were willing to provide safe passage and visas. So, you know, we'll hear more about how that's going, but that's been incredibly challenging work. For the NUJ, as well as kind of being part of that international effort, we've been lobbying really hard and doing our best to kind of seek engagement and to press levers with the government here in the UK. First of all, and to get the government to accept pre the evacuation of troops that journalists and media workers with links to the UK should be treated as distinct priorities, then to evacuate as many as possible in the run-up to the evacuation of British troops from the country, and since then to speed up the process of issuing visas and helping secure safe passage for those journalists most at risk. And I have to say, the government's initial response and evident of woeful lack of planning has been a complete shit show from my vantage point. The poor leadership and the sheer scale of the work still to do has completely overwhelmed the government departments involved, meaning that it's still on the back foot. All the while, as those processes and the bureaucracy kind of wrangles on, individuals are left scared and at risk, with hardly any ability to get updates on their applications or clarity on when or if they're going to be able to be relocated. And for those of us involved in, you know, signposting and making sure the government has got the details, the documentation of those individuals in need of their help, in need of their visas, it feels like you're kind of communicating with a black hole, an inbox within the heart of the Foreign Office. I wanted to kind of use the opportunity to update a bit on the position of BBC journalists and the work that we've been doing rather over the past period. And for some months ahead of August, the BBC was engaged with staff in Afghanistan over the restructure of editorial work from its Kabul office, planning to move a smaller team to Delhi and offer severance payments, completely inappropriate severance payments in the first outset, to those staff who would remain within Afghanistan as local hires outside of the bargaining unit that the joint unions have with the BBC in the UK. they repeatedly refused through that period to engage with the NUJ directly, and refused our request to carry out individual risk assessments. Farhad mentioned Swami, who's in our World Service branch, and also I'd also kind of add thanks to Pierre Vickery, our president. They've done sterling work throughout all of this period of time, and offering support to Farhad in his brilliant organising effort of staff within the Kabul office to make sure that those colleagues were treated appropriately and fairly. It was a very challenging situation. On the issue of risk assessments, as an example, right up to the fall of Kabul and the conversations I was having that weekend, when it was clear that there was a terrible crisis unfolding, the BBC's position remained that none of its team, over 100 people in Kabul, were at high risk, not a single person, not even any of their women journalists, which was patent nonsense when news was coming in from other parts of Afghanistan where the Taliban had taken control, where we were already seeing targeted attacks and even killings of journalists. It made absolutely no sense. I think it's fair to say from that point on, the BBC's efforts undoubtedly went up a massive gear with a crisis team deployed, involving executives and staff at the BBC at the highest level. I was engaged in regular daily briefings for quite a period of time with the BBC, and we were working through that period very hard to try and engage with the Foreign Office over our demands for all journalists with links to be with the UK to be given visas. In the end, the government started to issue visa waivers, which facilitated the evacuation, I think at that point, for almost 47 BBC staff and families before the airport closed. Many of us have got out since, but as Farhad said, there still are people there with a broader problem, being those individuals and of course their dependent family members who just don't have passports. And we'll have all seen the scenes in Kabul today and overnight as thousands of Afghans are trying to get hold of that vital bit of documentation to even enable them to leave the country. But I think that the reality is, even though that some of that effort really stepped up and was very intensive around that period, it all came too late. And it was a very chaotic and bungled kind of countdown to the evacuation of troops. So ultimately time ran out. You know, not enough people were able to even get to the airport, let alone to be able to get onto flights, particularly after all the commercial flights had ended. So plan Bs that were being put in place for charter flights to Qatar and Pakistan just went out the window once the airport was closed down. And I think from our perspective, nearly 8 weeks on now, the situation is still frustratingly slow. Gaining transparency and clarity from the government is ridiculously elusive, and it seems like that process is very much bogged down in needless bureaucracy and dithering. The visa waiver scheme that I'd mentioned, which enabled so many people to get out, was then inexplicably really set aside once the troops pulled out, even for those individuals who'd been cleared and approved and would have got a visa, would have had a seat on a flight, but couldn't physically get through the checkpoints and the crowds to access the airport and that flight to safety. It just meant that, so even though effectively their name was on the list, they had a place and you know, an entitlement for a home in the UK, that scheme ended, so they're no longer part of it, so they have to start again, and it's replaced by the new resettlement scheme. And the criteria at that stage for that hadn't even been finalised. It was still going through endless drafting processes within the Foreign Office, and there was no priority category for journalists at risk. So, you know, a complete mess, very much lacking in any empathy or understanding of the impact on human beings who were reliant on that work being done and being done in a professional and speedy way. I think Farhad's very powerful points about family members left behind is really important as well, and something we need to keep pressing on the government to acknowledge and act upon. The word dependence allowed, but in a very limited kind of British kind of interpretation of what dependence can be defined as. And it's obviously tragic that lots of people have had to make those terrible decisions about leaving people who they still fear, understandably, might fall victim to retaliations or pressure because of that connection they've got to journalists who've spent years reporting on what's been going on in the country, reporting on the activities of the Taliban. The NUJ and the IFJ, we've also been pushing to help, and will continue to lobby hard for action to issue visas to those former BBC journalists still in Afghanistan who've got very clear, albeit not immediately current, links with our public service broadcaster, so they are patently at significant risk. Understandably, they feel like they've been cast aside, and they feel that both about the BBC as well as about the British government. And so we're trying to do what we can to try and unlock that very immediate challenge that we're facing. We've seen in correspondence this week evidence of interviews given by Taliban commanders who are openly threatening retaliation and revenge against journalists who work for the BBC and CNN, you know, where I've seen specific references to, who are called traitors and dogs and enemies of Afghanistan. And I think the lack of urgency on the part of the UK government continues to be an enormous frustration to all of those organisations who are engaged in trying to provide urgent help to individuals whose lives are undoubtedly at risk. And that's not just us within the kind of trade union movement and the journalistic community. That's, you know, add in scores and scores of NGOs and others who've got those kind of close connections and people that they're trying to deploy their duty of care to. I also wanted to kind of highlight the ongoing efforts being made to ensure that the IFJ has the funds required to carry on this vital work. And I'm glad that Chris name-checked the appeal at the beginning of the meeting. I think Sarah's put into the chat box the link to how you can make a donation. And, you know, when we issued a call to all NUJ members, it felt like something positive and practical to be able to do at a really terrible time, to kind of enable members to do something, you know, to contribute some solidarity and some sort of kind of practical support. And really, you know, I knew that members would be supportive and responsive, but actually the scale of that generosity was quite something, you know, that's very gratifying. Members of the union from across UK, Ireland and our continental European branches have donated, I think it's in excess of 30 grand to date. That figure's growing all of the time. We're going to carry on pressing for those donations to keep coming in. And it's really important to understand that every single penny of the money that's going into that special fund, which is part of the IFJ's safety fund, all of it goes to help journalists in need directly. And the need hasn't gone away. I mean, it is just growing daily, and I'll be interested to kind of get the latest update from Jeremy on that. There's also a role for the union in helping support Afghan journalists who are arriving in the UK and in smaller numbers to Ireland, I think, as well. And I know, for example, the NCTJ is keen to help provide training. We're kind of talking to different organisations and employers about trying to encourage media outlets to provide work placements and jobs. As Farhad mentioned, it's really important we kind of keep pressure on the BBC to offer up employment for those journalists who've come here, whether it's in the UK or in other bureaux around the world, so that people have got real jobs and new homes that they can kind of settle into. And I know that the BBC already has started talking to its contractors about work and employment for wider kind of family members and dependents who've come across to the UK so far as well. And finally, I think I just say, when I first got involved with the NUJ, one of the things I very quickly came to admire was its kind of internationalism, and how, even as a relatively small trade union, we provide practical support and solidarity very much in a kind of journalist to journalist spirit, as well as that kind of important ethical framework for our work. And I think Daniel rightly raised that issue of solidarity and how we can continue to deploy that and improve as journalists. And I think for me, our work to date and in the weeks and months to come, the work that we still have to do, it's work and effort that really showcases how the NUJ can and does come together and kind of very robustly and in a meaningful way puts those collective principles into action. It's absolutely work we've got to kind of step up and continue to do. And Farhad and others I know who are on the call tonight, you absolutely have the commitment from the NUJ that we will not stint in doing that.
Great, thanks, Michelle. Okay, our next speaker, and then after this speaker, I'll be taking questions. We've also got one or two colleagues from the BBC and who've been in Afghanistan who want to say a quick word towards the end, but I'll take Jeremy and then questions first. Jeremy Dear is the Deputy General Secretary of the International Federation of Journalists. He's a former General Secretary of the NUJ and preceded Michelle, and we worked together on the National Executive Council. Before that, he worked as a journalist and led a strike at the Essex Chronicle for very nearly a year. And Good times, eh, Jeremy? Takes you back. Jeremy, tell us more about what the IFJ is up to.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, and thank you to the Ethics Council for organising the meeting, and a real heartfelt thank you to NUJ members everywhere, because, as Michelle alluded to, the amazing solidarity that we've seen from the union at every single level for our sisters and brothers in Afghanistan has been amazing. From donations to the IFJ safety fund, to co-opting staff to help us deal with the huge wave of appeals for assistance we received during those first 10 days after Kabul fell to the Taliban, to the lobbying efforts of the UK government and employers to help get those under threat to safety. It's been a real demonstration of what we mean by the phrase international solidarity. Just as one figure, 37% of all the funds collected globally have come directly from NUJ members. And that says an awful lot about the kind of commitment to international solidarity NUJ members have. So on behalf of not just the IFJ, but our two Afghan affiliates, the Afghan Independent Journalists Association, Afghan National Journalists Union, thank you so much. I was asked to talk a bit about the work that the IFJ and its affiliates have done over the past 8 weeks or so, and how your solidarity and that of other unions has supported that work. We've received tens of thousands of emails, phone calls, WhatsApp, Facebook messages, Twitter, from around 5,000 individual, most of them journalists or media workers seeking assistance, most of those people wanting to evacuate, to flee Afghanistan. The period up to the 31st of August and the withdrawal of Western troops was the most frantic, with heartbreaking, increasingly desperate messages arriving every few seconds, the kind of heartbreaking stories that Farhad so eloquently told us about in his intervention. People saying that they would rather kill themselves than allow their family to fall into the hands of IS or Taliban commanders, and that we needed to help them, and we needed to help them today. First, we had to triage those cases, and as Michelle said, that in itself creates an ethical dilemma for anybody. Were they really at risk? Were they really journalists? What documents did they have? Did they have any links with international media that would make it easier for us to be able to try to secure passage for them? Could we get them emergency humanitarian visas? And that our affiliates around the world were constantly lobbying their embassies and governments to try to secure humanitarian visas in that early period. I think we and others working on the evacuations at that point were naive, thinking that governments would be true to their word and evacuate all those at risk. As has become clear, and as Farhad and Michelle have made clear, in too many cases, including in the UK, the governments have done too little, imposed cumbersome procedures, non-recognition of family members, other restrictive criteria, are processing claims so slowly that people give up and risk their life trying to smuggle themselves out of the country, and then find that they are illegally in another country and therefore facing problems from authorities in those countries. Despite the obstacles, we were successful alongside other media freedom groups and with the help of affiliates in many countries in helping hundreds of journalists and their relatives to evacuate during that period to Europe, Canada, the US, Qatar, and above all to Pakistan. And that evacuation effort continues every day up to date and will do for months to come. However, following the withdrawal of troops, the airport was closed, the Taliban imposed new restrictions on those wanting to leave, and governments in reality feel less pressure now and have become slower and harder to deal with. For example, today the US P2 program, which is one of their special programs for Afghans, has said it will take between 9 and 12 months for any application to be processed. In France, we're being told it will take 6 months for an application to be processed. And as Michelle said about the UK, the criteria are restrictive, the process frustratingly slow, and those former BBC employees are among those still waiting for any positive response from the FCDO. Countries like Pakistan, which initially were accepting hundreds of Afghan refugees, have become more reluctant unless these people already have a third country visa or a pass giving them a right to onwards travel. There are fewer flights, land routes are regularly closed. We've had individuals waiting at borders, living on the street at the border for weeks, trying to cross the Uzbek or Tajik borders. And every single day we still receive emails from frightened individuals asking us if their case has been resolved. And there's actually a growing anger and frustration at people like us, because people who are scared, who are in poverty, who are separated from families, cannot understand why the international community appears to have abandoned them. And we are the people they can reach, the people who will talk to them, and therefore the ones who are at the sharp end of their frustration and their anger. But alongside the evacuations, there are other important issues. There are thousands of journalists who remain in Afghanistan. In many cases, they face threats. In many of them are in poverty. There's 153 media closed in 20 provinces. 75% of journalists in Afghanistan are unemployed. A survey carried out by our affiliate covering more than 1,400 journalists in 28 provinces published last week showed 67% of journalists have lost their jobs since the Taliban took control. 69% of media organizations have closed down. 70% have faced threats, mainly by the Taliban, but also by ISIS or unknown groups. And the majority of those, around 2/3, are women. But the closures of media are not always or even principally because of Taliban rules and edicts, but because the economic collapse and withdrawal of development aid has deprived media which relied so much on that income. And as a result of joblessness and the collapse of state institutions, many have fallen into poverty. And as a result of threats, many are internally displaced. So our second main area of work is providing emergency support to families in need inside Afghanistan. For example, on Saturday, one of our affiliates distributed 10,000 euros in assistance packages to 32 families identified as in need. The money covers things like food, lodging, and basic necessities. Other individuals have been helped with small amounts, often just £100, to find a guest house for a few nights, for local transport, to enable them to move from an area where they are under threat to somewhere else, to pay to keep their phone credit, and so on. The third area of work is supporting those who fled but are still not formally resettled. And so our Pakistani union is helping many of those who fled to Islamabad to find shelter, buy food, file visa requests at embassies. In Germany and Belgium, our unions are helping people who've been evacuated to navigate the asylum system. And we're getting increasing requests from those who've now fled to Turkey or other countries for similar kinds of support. The fourth area of work is the lobbying of authorities going on in dozens of countries by our affiliated unions. A committee in Canada, for example, is dealing with around 500 cases, in France 300. In the US, our unions are approaching those organizations who funded media to urge them to take their responsibility now for those people they formerly employed. As Michelle said, they're doing in the UK. We're also working with One IFRA, the employers organization, to try to find work and freelance opportunities and commissions for those journalists who are now in exile. And I really want to thank Michelle and the NUJ for the work that she's done in the UK in terms of lobbying the government. And I know that some of the ex-BBC colleagues who are still stuck in Kabul are here on this meeting today, and we issued, Michelle and I, the IFJ and NUJ, a joint statement yesterday or the day before, and Michelle and I were talking today about the next steps of what we can do to make sure that this case becomes a priority for the UK government, using the various international coalitions that the UK is part of, including the Media Freedom Coalition, to put them on the spot for what they are doing in terms of providing visas and relocating all those former BBC staff. We feel collectively that we have done so much, but actually it is a drop in the ocean compared to the need that there is. And so I mean, I obviously urge you to keep up the brilliant solidarity that you have done. If I've got 2 minutes or a minute, Chris, there's a couple of quick ethical issues in the work that we're doing that I think are important. The focus is massively on evacuation and the thousands of people who want to leave, but others are clear. If all the journalists leave, who is going to be shining a light on what the Taliban do in Afghanistan? So it's a very important ethical question for us, that we don't just try to get every single person who wants to out of the country, but that we work with our affiliates on the ground to look towards the longer term and provide the safety training, the equipment, the support to independent media, the support to those journalists who can continue their work. And then secondly, there is this ethical dimension about who gets prioritized for evacuation. And Michelle talked a little bit about the really difficult triaging process that we have to go through. We know it is simpler if people have worked for international media, if they have a passport, if they speak English and can fill all the forms in a way that is easily understandable for people who are receiving those forms, if they've been educated in the UK or the US. It saves us a lot of work, it saves government a lot of work. It's preferred by governments, but is it really addressing those who are most at risk and in the fairest way? And I think the international community has to understand why there is some anger and frustration at seeing some people being able to access the system very easily, while others who are genuinely under threat are not able to do so. And so for us there, it's very important that we source several opinions from our affiliates and others we work with to try to address that unconscious bias. So thank you again to everybody from the NUJ. And I know I can see some names of people on this call who've been in touch with me about how they can help this person or that person, and they can be assured that we are doing everything we can every day to secure the visas and the support that's necessary for Afghan journalists.
That's great. Thanks, Jeremy. I want to move to questions now. We've got one here. I mean, you raised the issue of ethics at the end, Jeremy, and this person is concerned about that. I'll read the question. The occupation of Afghanistan was maintained by the use of force and violence by the UK and US military. It was hated by the Afghan people and collapsed before the US-UK had even left the country. What are the ethical questions for journalists whose reporting support tries to legitimate such a violent occupation? I don't know if anybody, I'm Daniel, that might be something that perhaps you want to try and answer, or at least give us a steer on.
Sure. Well, I'll try and link it back to my area of knowledge that's relevant, which is reporting on displacement. And I think I suppose the general principle, though it's a bit trite to say, is that it's really important for journalists to report on violence carried out by the countries that they live in, as much as it is on violence perpetrated by other people, other actors, and so on. But in terms of sort of the ethics of reporting on refugee issues and on migration, I think that's when I was talking earlier about a really important principle being aiming to give as full a picture as possible in your journalism, this is crucial, because I think that often the two issues, i.e. sort of foreign policy, use of military power and so on, is treated as a separate story to people fleeing wars. And actually, obviously, there, at the very least, there's a huge overlap, and very often there's a direct causal relationship. And I think Afghanistan is a very good example where the full story is quite difficult to tell, but I think even so, it's often omitted. You know, this is a country that has had almost 40 years of continuous war. You've had several major world powers invade and occupy the country over that period of time. And throughout that whole period, there's been, one of the world's largest and most prolonged refugee diasporas. But I think quite often reporting just tends to treat that as a kind of fact of life, rather than paying close attention to what is actually displacing people at particular points in that story. So I mentioned the fact that during the 2015 refugee crisis, which was often in Europe, which was often discussed as if it was only about refugees from, or mainly about refugees from Syria, Afghans were the second largest group of refugees to come to Europe at that point, if I recall correctly. And that was linked to not only the 20-year occupation conflict with the Taliban, but specific things that were happening in Afghanistan from 2015 onwards as the security situation deteriorated, and the US then was beginning to withdraw its troops and so on. And I think that was a kind of failure, certainly of the media that I'm familiar with in the UK, to keep telling that story, so that when it got to August this year, I think to a lot of people, it felt like a sudden surprise that the situation was like it was. And I think better linking together of telling the stories of refugees with telling the stories of countries that they had been forced to flee would sort of help alleviate those kind of gaps, help fill those kind of gaps in future.
Thanks, Daniel. That's great. Farhad, did you want to come in on that? You're muted, Farhad.
Sorry, I don't want to talk about politics, actually.
Okay, well, that's fine. I'm quite happy to
look at the history of Afghanistan. One, superpower came, and after 20 years, leave Afghanistan, and the more than 30 million people living there, and I'm really for my people there, and I'd like to talk about this. Thank you.
That's fine. I just wasn't sure. You came in with a video, and I thought maybe you wanted to come in. And other questions that we've had, I mean, one of the key ones coming through is how can we help? And you started to answer that, Jeremy. But a question that I know that came up at my branch is, how can branches contact refugees, especially refugee journalists and media workers who are perhaps living in their area, who they might want to help, sort of adopt, if you will? Have you any ideas on that, Jeremy, perhaps, or Michelle?
Well, I think one of the things, particularly, as more people have now arrived, and talking to Farhad earlier, and he's in London, we've got a good support network from a BBC perspective in terms of our BBC branches. We've got 2 branches in London. We've got lots of other geographic branches around the country who have BBC and NUJ members within them. And I think it would be great as the next step to try and make sure that journalists who come across now from Afghanistan are looped into those branches. I think probably everybody's endured the end of the quarantine period in hotels now, and is able to kind of more engage with people. So that's something we'll pick up in discussions with Farhad about how we can best support that. I did want to make just a broader point, maybe, in reference to a couple of things that have come up in the chat box, that I think is an issue, is a trade union issue, kind of, that is linked into the kind of the ethics of reporting on refugee issues. And I think it's the question of representation in workplaces, where, for so long, many journalists have sought refuge over years in the UK, elsewhere, and that they end up not being able to gain employment in the profession that they forged their career in elsewhere. They can find it incredibly challenging to get meaningful work, which is a sheer loss of their expertise, talent, and I think the industry has been very slow in not taking up those opportunities to bring those people in and to provide them with work and to provide that greater insight and experience into their kind of news team. So I think the work that we're trying to do to ensure that people coming from the BBC's offices, former BBC staff, actually gain jobs, you know, as soon as arriving here as they possibly can, I think is incredibly important. And for once, in this situation in recent weeks, there's been more, you know, maybe I'm being too optimistic, but there's been more interest and engagement from media outlets, other newspaper groups, other broadcasters in also trying to facilitate work placements or short-term contracts and things like that. And I think we need to be doing all we can to maximise on providing those opportunities, because inevitably representation, people with different backgrounds in newsrooms, have an impact on the content that's created journalistically. And, you know, we all see those gaps when you walk into any newsroom across the UK or in Ireland. So I think that kind of practical work that the NUJ can help with, the training and the placement opportunities, trying to match people up and getting some buy-in from employers, is something that will also have a broader impact on that kind of journalistic reporting, representation and ethical backdrop. That's really important as well.
Chris,
can I just add to that, Chris?
Yeah.
I mean, so here in Belgium, along with the Belgian union, journalist unions, and some of the civil society organisations, working with exiled journalists from a whole range of countries, they created an organisation called Engage, and its purpose is to not only provide support when people arrived, but to be able to provide the networks, seek out work opportunities, provide training, sometimes even providing the tools to work. So making sure people have access to computer and office space and things like that for exiled journalists, to make them feel that they are part of the journalistic community at the earliest possible opportunity. How you always reach all those people is not always easy to do, but by having a kind of public profile, this organization is able to reach out to others. The question that someone asked about what other things people can do beyond making a donation, which so many people have. I mean, one of the things that is essential for the UK government and for all governments is to make journalists a priority group. So there are a number of priority groups that different countries have, which makes it easier to be able to then get visas. So both in terms of the general category of journalists, the lobbying of MPs and government to make journalists one of the priorities is critical. And then there are particular groups of journalists that you can lobby on as well. And that's one of the things that Michelle and I were talking about, how we work with the NUJ parliamentary group in order to try to get the ex-BBC colleagues to be a priority for the UK government. So if that is something that we can talk to the parliamentary group about, that may be a way in which people can then also support that by writing to their MPs individually and trying to get MPs to raise the issue on the floor of the House of Commons.
Lovely, thanks, Jeremy. We're pretty much at the end, colleagues. I have promised to bring one or two people in very quickly. Abdul Malik, I've said I'll allow very quickly to speak, provided I can bring him in. We will do that now. Not sure if I can do this. Abdul, are you there? Can you?
I think if Abdul just unmutes himself, he should be able to speak now.
Okay. Can you unmute yourself, Abdul? No. The other person is Moes Mikhail. I don't know if you unmute yourself. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Hi, everyone. I don't know if you can hear me.
We can. Yes, thank you.
Okay. I'm father of chapel for Afghan service at the BBC, and as my colleague Farhad explains, the situation is disastrous in Afghanistan. Killing, torture, arrest are happening as we speak. It's extremely hard for us here in London in terms of reporting, speaking to the Taliban, specifically when their spokesperson accuses you of promoting propaganda and all sort of things. And when you have your family members, close family members in Afghanistan, you're quite worried. I mean, we are all very worried. Yes, we managed so the BBC could evacuate our colleagues out of Afghanistan, but many are still left behind. Many can't bring their family members because they are not classified as close family members by the UK government. Some are former BBC employees, and some are families of those who sacrificed their lives for the BBC. Journalists working in London have family members such as parents, siblings. They're in very harsh situation. They're receiving daily threats. They are in hiding and they fear for their lives. I wanted to share some information that we are working with the BBC to put pressure on the government to recognize this group of people. But so far, there was no promising outcome. I wonder if NUJ could do something to support this and to put pressure on the government, or maybe issue some kind of statements that they consider.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I think thanks very much. We will do that. Abdul had joined us, but he's gone again. No, I've lost him, colleagues. Well, that's the end of our session. Thank you all very much for joining us. I'd like to thank our guests, Farhad Mohammadi, Daniel Trilling, Jeremy Deere, and Michelle Stanistreet, for their excellent input. I hope you found this seminar very useful. We intend to continue this theme in the future, and we hope that we'll see you at those meetings then. Thank you very much for joining us. Good night to everybody.